All right, everyone. Welcome to the last part of our lecture on the spinal cord. We're going to talk about spinal cord injuries. So this is a slide that we saw at the beginning of the lecture. So the spinal cord is within the vertebral column. And remember that we name the different levels of the spinal cord for the corresponding vertebrae. So we have cervical regions of the spinal cord, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And just like the brain is regionalized, so different parts of the brain do different things, the spinal cord is also regionally organized. So the upper levels of the spinal cord are the ones that have neurons and axons that they're going to go to upper parts of the body, and the middle parts of the spinal cord are sending signals to the middle or receiving signals from the middle part of the body, and then so on and so forth. So what we're looking at here is something called a dermatome, and it's showing us the sensory map for where those sensory axons then are going into the spinal cord. So let's see, I guess I'll try using the black pen. So you can see here, your upper shoulder is yellow and it says, I don't know, I don't have my glasses. Here they are, C5, right? Yes. So the sensory neuron axon that is bringing sensory information from the top of your shoulder is going to enter your spinal cord at the C5 level, right? That is the spinal nerve. The C5 spinal nerve is the one that axon is going to travel in, right? And right here around your belly button is usually around T10, right? So sensory neuron axons bringing information from that part of your body are going to be going in those spinal nerves that are at T10, and so on and so forth. So this also applies to the motor neurons, although it's not as matchy-matchy. So this is a sensory map, these dermatomes, but it's pretty similar. So let's talk a little bit about that patellar or knee-jerk reflex that we just learned about. So you can see here from this diagram, I have to get my glasses again, that just below the kneecap there, that is L4. So those sensory neurons are going to be coming in at the L4 level on that level there. And so then we know, so remember the quadriceps muscle is the muscle, and that's the anterior thigh. And you already learned that the nerve to the anterior thigh is the femoral nerve, which comes off of the lumbar plexus, right? So the motor signal back out then is also coming from this same area of the spinal cord and coming back out. So the motor functions and the sensory functions of the spinal cord are regionalized. It kind of maps out from higher to lower, then to higher and lower parts of the body. It's not perfect. You can kind of see it's not just shink, 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 but it corresponds quite nicely. So that was talking about reflexes. Now, for most things, we use the brain, right? So we're consciously aware of things. We're consciously deciding to do things. So that means if I've got a sensory neuron axon coming in here, right, it's going to synapse with another neuron, which is then going to send that signal up through the spinal cord, through those columns that we talked about of white matter, up to the brain. Similarly, if I decide voluntarily to, flex my fingers, then I've got a signal that is coming down from the brain through the spinal cord, and then it's going to synapse with a motor neuron, and then it's going to be sent out on a spinal nerve. So I've got these axons going up and down, right? I've got these signals coming up to the brain and down from the body, and they're traveling in the columns of the spinal cord. So it's not just the levels of the neurons that we talked about before, right? So if I'm looking at this level of the spinal cord, everything that's coming down from above there, why did that not work? Everything that's coming down from above there has to come through that level, and everything that's coming from below and up through there, that didn't go the right color, blue. All right, everything that's coming up has to go through that level as well. So let's take a look. So again, here is a different dermatome map. It's the same information, just slightly different color scheme. Again, remembering that it's the neurons that are located at that level, at that particular cucumber slice, that are going to be important for that region of the spinal cord. But we're not only going to find the sensory neurons for that dermatome, or at least their axons, and the motor neurons for muscles in that general region, but we're also going to find sensory axons that are traveling up from below that level, and motor axons that are traveling down from higher, that are trying to get to lower levels still. Let's do an example. So let's imagine that what I'm looking at right here is this slice. Let's imagine this slice is from kind of T10. So T10 is right here. So if this is the T10 slice through the spinal cord. So I've certainly got some interneurons here that you can see. I'm going to switch the highlighter so it doesn't get too messy. So I've certainly got some interneurons here. I've got some motor neuron cell bodies here. I have the axons of my sensory neurons that are coming in corresponding to that level to that dermatome. But then I also have in the columns, I have sensory neuron axons that are coming from below. So if this is T10, that's kind of your belly button level. My sensory axons from my toes and my feet and my ankles and my thighs and everything that are bringing sensory information up to my brain are coming through that level of the spinal cord. And conversely, in the columns over here, I've got motor signals. So signals from my brain down to the parts below my belly button, my umbilicus, have to come through this level, right? There's no like bypass around as you are going through that entire spinal cord. So what this means is if you get an injury at a certain level of the spinal cord, you have cut off, so they're showing you here, if you have a high cervical lesion, you have cut off the ability of axons from underneath to come up to the brain, so you can be consciously aware of those sensations. So you're not going to have any sensation. You're going to be numb below the level of the injury. Similarly, your brain can't send any signals down to parts of your body that are below that level if you had a complete injury at that level of the spinal cord. So therefore, all the muscles below that level can't receive any signals and are going to be paralyzed. So the level of your spinal cord injury tells us what type of symptoms someone is going to have. So that very high cervical one up here, right? So basically everything in blue is paralyzed and numb. So they have no sensation and they have no voluntary movement. No signals from the brain can get down, no signals from the body below that level can get up. You see here, if it's a little bit lower, well, then they have some control over and some sensation up here. This is, approximately a T10 level they're showing you, where now it's just from the waist down. You have no sensation and no motor control, so therefore you're paralyzed. So that's referred to as paraplegia, meaning two, whereas quadriplegia or tetraplegia means all four extremities are paralyzed. And then here's someone with a level even a little bit lower, but it's still getting both of the lower extremities there. So that is why the level is so important if we're talking about a spinal cord injury. Now, you might have picked up on the fact that I kept saying, or hopefully I kept remembering to say, no voluntary movement, no intentional movement. So you might be curious, well, what about your spinal reflexes in someone who has had a spinal cord injury? So here's our map of a spinal reflex. So we have a sensory stimulus out here in the body. It comes through and to the spinal cord and then right back out to the body. So remember, we said it's kind of cool, spinal reflexes don't need the brain. So spinal reflexes don't rely on any axons going up or coming down. So as long as this is not the exact level where the injury was, as long as this part of your spinal cord is intact, even if it's cut off from everything above it, a spinal reflex will still work because all of the components here are still intact. There is no need to communicate with the brain, so the reflexes will still work. As we'll talk about later, they're often even exaggerated or more pronounced than in people who still have that intact connection with the brain. But they're still going to work because they don't require those communications up and down to and from the brain. So in summary, spinal cord is regionalized, right, to all the different levels of the body. So if you have a complete injury of the spinal cord where it's imagine it's completely cut or completely crushed, then you can't get those axon signals coming up. So you're going to be numb from that level down, and you can't get motor axons down through there, so you can't get motor signals down below that level, so you'll be paralyzed below that level. So that is our summary for spinal cord injuries, and I'll look forward to seeing you in lab.